They had been told it could never happen. Japanese fighter pilots defending the home islands were assured that American fighters could not possibly cross the vast Pacific distances, escort the giant bombers, and still have fuel left to fight over Tokyo itself. Yet on a cold spring morning in 1945, as the first light touched Mount Fuji's snow-capped peak, that comforting illusion was about to shatter. Before we dive into this turning point in air warfare, and what it reveals about technology, industry, and human courage, if you enjoy detailed stories like this, consider subscribing to the channel so you do not miss the next deep dive into the hidden mechanics of history. At dawn on April 7, 1945, the waters of Tokyo Bay lay calm under a pale sky as 91 North American P-51D Mustangs of the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups approached their rendezvous point. In the cockpit of his sleek fighter, Major James B. Tapp wrapped his gloved hand around the control stick, feeling every vibration from the Merlin engine ahead. Under his wings sat 6 half-inch Browning M2 machine guns, fully loaded with armor-piercing incendiary ammunition that could tear through metal fuel and flesh in an instant. This was not just another patrol. It was the first act in a new kind of air war. Those early P-51D models carried a staggering volume of ammunition. Each inboard gun was fed by 500 rounds, while the center and outboard weapons had 270 rounds apiece for a total of just over 2,000 rounds of half-inch bullets waiting to be unleashed. Later refinements would trim the inboard load to 400 rounds for improved reliability, dropping the total to about 1,880 rounds, but on this morning the Mustangs were still in their heavy-gunned configuration. Below the formation, Mount Fuji rose above the clouds, its snow-covered summit gleaming in the first light. Its perfectly recognizable cone was more than a symbol. It was a navigation beacon that pilots would repeatedly reference throughout the mission as they threaded their way across the Japanese home islands. As the sun climbed, higher shadows stretched across a landscape that until now had never seen hostile single-engine fighters. Rice fields formed neat geometric patterns, small villages clustered around roads and streams, and military installations lay scattered among them, built in the belief that geography itself offered a shield. The mission the Mustangs were flying that day was something military planners only a few years earlier had labeled impossible. Their task was to escort Boeing B-29 superfortresses deep into the Japanese heartland from a base roughly 750 miles away, a round trip that would push the limits of fuel, endurance, and human concentration. For single-engine fighters, such very long-range missions had once been pure fantasy. Now they were routine. At roughly 700 hours, that fantasy became a nightmare for the defenders. More than 100 Japanese interceptors clawed their way into the morning haze, converging on the combined bomber and fighter formation. Through the cockpit glass, Japanese pilots saw something that struck them like a physical blow: American single-engine fighters over Tokyo itself. Their commanders had insisted that the B-29s would have to come alone, that no escort fighter could ever cross such distances and still fight. Yet here the Mustangs were banking confidently above the capital. The psychological shock was immediate and profound. Worse still for Japanese morale, these were not Navy carrier fighters with limited legs popping up from nearby task forces. The aircraft in front of them were land-based United States Army Air Forces fighters that had somehow crossed hundreds of miles of open ocean to arrive over the imperial capital with fuel left to spare. To meet this unexpected threat, Japanese commanders threw their best and their leftovers into the same sky. The latest Nakajima Ki 84 Hayate fighters, which Allied intelligence called Frank, flew alongside older Ki 43 Hayabusa Ki 44 Shoki and Ki 61 Hien Army fighters backed by Navy A6, M0, and N1K2J Shiden interceptors. On paper, the mix seemed formidable. In reality, the cracks were already showing. The Ki 84 in particular inspired hope. At certain altitudes and speeds, this sleek radial-engined fighter could outclimb and outmaneuver both the North American P-51 and the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Japanese pilots believed that if they could bring the fight into those narrow performance windows, they might tilt the odds in their favor. What the coming combat would demonstrate instead was the enormous technological and industrial gulf that had opened between the two nations. It would also make brutally clear why so many pilots on both sides of the front lines would later look back and call the P-51 the perfect long-range fighter. That perfection was not preordained. The Mustang began life as a stopgap design developed at high speed for export to Britain early in the war. The first variants used Allison engines that performed well at low altitude, but lacked the high-altitude punch needed for true air superiority. The transformation came when British engineers installed Rolls-Royce Merlin engines into the Mustang airframe, discovering that the combination of an efficient American wing and a powerful two-stage supercharged British engine produced a world-beating fighter. This marriage of American aerodynamic talent and British powerplant excellence turned a promising design into a masterpiece. The ultimate expression of this partnership was the P-51D. This version gave the United States Army Air Forces a fighter that could operate at high altitudes, fly for immense distances, and still mix it up with enemy fighters in a turning fight or diving attack. Over Europe, it had already proven its worth by escorting bomber streams all the way to Berlin and back-breaking the Luftwaffe's ability to challenge daylight raids. Now, astonishingly, that same high-altitude, long-range Guardian was being sent from Iwo Jima to Tokyo and back again, extending its shadow across an entirely new theater. At the heart of this capability sat the Packard V1650-7, a license-built version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin 66. With water injection engaged, it produced roughly 1,695 horsepower at takeoff and could be pushed to about 1,720 horsepower for short emergency bursts. More important than the raw numbers was the two-stage two-speed supercharger bolted to its back. This complex device compressed the thin air at high altitude in 2 steps, allowing the Merlin to maintain strong power where Japanese engines with single-stage superchargers wheezed and lost performance. Thanks to this power plant and the Mustang's clean aerodynamics, the P-51D could reach a top speed of about 440 miles per hour at around 25,000 feet and operate at altitudes approaching 42,000 feet. Its armament of 6 wing-mounted half-inch Browning M2 machine guns offered a devastating and highly predictable wall of fire. The weapon system was not just powerful, it had been mathematically optimized. Each Browning fired around 800 rounds per minute, meaning that all 6 together could hurl roughly 4,800 rounds per minute, or about 80 rounds per second, into a tightly focused cone. Each armor-piercing incendiary bullet weighed roughly 46 grams and left the muzzle at close to 2,900 feet per second. That combination of mass and velocity delivered immense kinetic energy on impact. Against metal aircraft structures and unprotected fuel tanks, a brief burst was often enough to punch through armor plating, shatter engines, and ignite gasoline-turning fighters and bombers alike into blazing wrecks. A well-flown P-51 did not need long, carefully aimed streams. It needed a second, perhaps 2, to write the fate of an enemy pilot in tracer fire. By the end of 1944, the Mustang's combat record had convinced American planners to make it the backbone of their fighter forces in Europe. 14 out of 15 fighter squadrons in the United States 8th Air Force flew Mustangs, a statistic that underscored both the aircraft's superiority and the sheer scale of American production. North American Aviation's plants in Englewood, California and Dallas, Texas ran around the clock 365 days a year. At peak output, a new Mustang rolled off the assembly line roughly every hour. By the time the war ended, a total of about 15,586 Mustangs of all versions had been built, including roughly 8,156 P-51D models alone. That single subtype outnumbered Japan's entire fighter production for the last 2 years of the war. The same industrial muscle that poured Mustangs into European skies now made very long-range operations over the Pacific possible. With a pair of 110-gallon drop tanks slung beneath their wings, P-51D Mustangs could routinely fly missions of about 1,500 statute miles, and under the right conditions, pilots could stretch this to roughly 1,600 miles. To picture this, imagine flying from Los Angeles to Little Rock, entirely over open water in a single-engine aircraft, with no alternate landing fields except the ocean. For the men strapped into the cockpits, every vibration from the Merlin was a reminder that a single mechanical failure could mean hours in a life raft or no chance at all. The key to making such missions repeatable lay not only in the fuel carried, but in how efficiently it was burned. At economical cruise settings, the Merlin engine sipped fuel compared to many of its contemporaries, using roughly 65 gallons per hour while still maintaining respectable speed. That efficiency was multiplied by the Mustang's laminar flow wing, developed by North American aerodynamicist Edgar Schmood. Unlike conventional wings, which allowed the airflow to turn turbulent relatively early along their chord, the laminar flow wing kept the airflow smooth over a much greater percentage of its surface. This delayed the transition to turbulence and sharply reduced drag by as much as about 35% compared to older airfoil shapes. Less drag meant less power needed to maintain speed, which in turn meant more miles from each gallon of fuel. Facing such a machine, Japan pinned its hopes on the best fighter it could put into reasonably large-scale production, the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, whose name meant gale. It entered service with the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service in June of 1944, far too late to exploit the early war window when Japanese air power seemed unstoppable. Although Allied intelligence would later call the Frank the best Japanese fighter to serve in significant numbers, the phrase significant numbers masked an uncomfortable truth. What Japan counted as mass production would have looked like limited prototype runs to American managers accustomed to huge standardized assembly lines. On paper, the Ki-84 had impressive credentials. It combined high speed with excellent maneuverability and carried an armament that at first glance outclassed the Mustang's machine guns. In its heavier armed configurations, the Hayate mounted two 30mm Ho 155 cannons and two 20mm Ho 5 cannons, giving it a punch that could rip a bomber apart with just a few hits. Yet the reality lurking behind those numbers was harsh. The 30mm guns usually carried only 50 rounds each, while the 20mm weapons held about 150 rounds apiece. That meant roughly 400 rounds of ammunition in total. The Mustang, even in its later, slightly reduced ammunition configuration, still carried around 1,880 rounds of half-inch ammunition, and early aircraft carried more than 2,000 rounds. The Ki-84's engine reflected the same tension between impressive design and painful reality. It was powered by the Nakajima Ha-45 Homari, an 18-cylinder radial engine with fuel injection, and a single-stage 2-speed supercharger. With water methanol injection to cool and densify the incoming air, it was rated at about 2,000 horsepower at takeoff. Early prototypes showed real promise, reaching speeds of roughly 387 miles per hour in level flight, and later claims suggested that under perfect conditions with high-octane fuel and expert tuning, the Hayate might touch around 427 miles per hour. On the test stand and on blueprints, this looked like a worthy rival to the American fighters. However, the harsh conditions of late-war Japan told a very different story. Under relentless bombing with dwindling supplies of high-quality steel and aluminum and a workforce stretched to the breaking point, production quality collapsed. Factories could no longer hold the tight tolerances that a complex high-performance engine like the Homari required. Desperate improvisations crept into every assembly line. Substituted materials, rushed heat treatments, and overworked inspection crews meant that the Hayates leaving the plants often fell far short of their design potential. The technological contest between the P-51D and the Ki-84 was not just about specifications, it was about whether a nation could still build fuel and maintain its best machines at scale. In that contest, Japan was already losing before many of its pilots ever saw a Mustang over Tokyo. The impressive specifications of the Ki-84 mattered little if the aircraft could not survive routine field operations, and in the brutal reality of 1945 Japan maintenance crews faced a nightmare each time a Hayate rolled onto the ramp. The Homari engine, already a temperamental machine, even under ideal factory conditions, demanded meticulous tuning and scrupulous upkeep that the shrinking pools of mechanics could no longer provide. Pilots frequently discovered that their engines ran unevenly bled oil or overheated during climbs. Even worse, the landing gear, which on paper was rugged enough for rough airfields, had become a point of dread. Under the weight of fuel and ammunition, the struts could buckle without warning. A hard landing or a slight crosswind often meant a collapsed gear leg, a broken aircraft, and sometimes a dead pilot. The reason for these failures lay in the bowels of Japan's industrial collapse. Japanese steelworks in the final years of the war could no longer produce alloys of consistent quality. Heat treatment processes rushed or sabotaged by overworked and underfed laborers left impurities locked inside the metal. These hidden flaws turned landing gear into potential death traps. Every time a Ki-84 touched down, its pilot held his breath, praying that the struts, whose outward appearance gave no hint of their inner weakness, would not fold. Japan could not afford such losses. Every aircraft destroyed on landing was another hole punched in a shrinking air defense network, and every pilot killed represented months of irreplaceable training flushed away. While Japan slipped into this downward spiral, the United States moved in the opposite direction. American production lines, instead of deteriorating under pressure, became smoother and more precise. Repetition, refined tooling, refined quality, and quality refined confidence. The more aircraft the Americans built, the better each one became. By contrast, Japanese pilots often stepped into cockpits unsure whether their aircraft would start properly, whether the guns would fire, whether the brakes would hold, or whether the engine would remain intact at high power settings. In practical terms, this meant that Japanese pilots faced not only the enemy in the sky but also the uncertainty of their own machines. The scale of the imbalance was stark. Japan managed to build only about 3,514 Ki-84s in total. Even this number masked a grim truth. Many of these aircraft never flew in combat. Some sat idle because there were no trained pilots to fly them. Others lacked fuel, spare parts, or functioning engines. At any given moment, perhaps half were truly combat-ready. Meanwhile, American factories continued to supply an unbroken stream of Mustangs, each one ready to go to war the moment it reached an airfield. Fuel shortages dealt a final blow to any hope of parity. American pilots took off with tanks full of high-grade 100-octane gasoline refined in Texas and California. Japanese pilots, on the other hand, flew with fuel that sometimes rated as low as 80 octane and rarely better than 87. Such low quality meant their engines detonated, overheated, or lost power exactly when pilots needed it most. To stretch their dwindling supplies, Japanese engineers experimented with pine root oil alcohol distilled from sweet potatoes and even the residue of sake production. None of these substitutes produced reliable performance. Engines coughed, sputtered, or failed without warning, turning takeoffs and climbs into acts of faith rather than predictable aerodynamic events. While Japan wrestled with failing machines, the American formation that morning drew closer to its rendezvous with breathtaking precision. When the P-51s of the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups approached the designated point, they found the massive silver shapes of the Boeing B-29s already beginning their assembly. Captain Art Bridge later compared the moment to watching a school of enormous silver fish glide through the sky, each bomber catching the sunlight in a flash of aluminum brilliance. It was more than a beautiful sight. It was a triumph of navigation, timing, and planning that required every link in the chain: factories, supply ships, weather stations, mechanics, pilots, and radios to perform flawlessly. The Mustangs had come an astonishing distance to meet the bombers. Their journey of roughly 750 miles across the open Pacific relied primarily on dead reckoning time checks and the basic radio compass. Throughout the climb, the Merlin engines automatically adjusted their mixture, leaning out as the air thinned. At higher altitudes, the superchargers switched seamlessly from low blower to high blower, ensuring that the aircraft retained both power and responsiveness. It was a masterclass in industrial engineering. The engines managed themselves with such reliability that pilots could focus entirely on navigation and fuel management. As the American formation crossed the coast of Honshu, the pilots prepared for battle. They reached for the release controls and dropped their 110-gallon fuel tanks, which tumbled away in silver arcs. Some struck the ground and burst into fireballs. Others bounced into rice paddies. The sky ahead flickered with movement as Japanese interceptors rose to meet them. For many Japanese pilots, the sight that greeted them suspended disbelief. They had expected bombers. They had not imagined that long-ranged land-based fighters could appear above Tokyo. Flight Sergeant Totanimizu of the 56th Sentai later recalled that when the alarm sounded, his squadron believed only B-29s were approaching. The idea that American fighters had arrived seemed impossible. Yet when he saw the Mustangs overhead, sleek, confident, and utterly out of place, he felt an icy realization settle over him. If the American fighters could reach Tokyo, then nothing Japan had been promised about the safety of the home islands was true. In that moment, he understood that the war was no longer merely difficult, it was unwinnable. The first clashes confirmed this bleak assessment. Major James B. Tapp reported that the Japanese formations approached in their traditional three-plane shot-eye groups. But something vital had changed. The formations lacked cohesion. Leaders committed to attacks while their wingmen hesitated or failed to follow. Some pilots seemed unsure, others obviously inexperienced. The Mustangs dove through with a speed advantage of nearly 100 miles per hour, firing short, deadly bursts before climbing back into the safety of altitude. Their attacks had the precision of a guillotine, sharp and final. The reason for this collapse was no mystery. By the final year of the war, Japan's pilot training pipeline had disintegrated. Many replacements arriving at frontline units had barely 50 hours of total flying time. They had little or no gunnery practice. They had trained almost entirely in clear weather and had never flown solely by instruments. Their manuals described tactics, but their instructors, once the best in the world, had been killed in the Solomons, New Guinea, the Philippines, or the Marianan skies. In contrast, American pilots typically arrived in theater with roughly 600 hours of flight training, including extensive gunnery formation, flying instrument navigation, and practice against captured enemy aircraft. The results were brutal. On this first mission alone, the Mustangs achieved a kill ratio of roughly 13-1, destroying about 26 Japanese aircraft while losing only 2 of their own. As the campaign intensified, those numbers worsened for Japan. Kill ratios of 20-1 or 30-1 became common not because Japanese pilots lacked courage, but because they faced an enemy with superior machines, superior training, and a deep well of experience. Altitude made the disparity even more extreme. Above 20,000 feet, air combat favored aircraft with strong climb rates, powerful superchargers, and engines that could maintain sea-level horsepower. The P-51 excelled in this vertical arena. Its 2-stage supercharger fed the Merlin a steady supply of cool, dense air, allowing it to retain its performance well into the thin blue heights. The Ki-84's single-stage supercharger, lacking an intercooler, and a second compression stage, fell far short. Its power dropped sharply above 20,000 feet, turning it from a formidable opponent into an underpowered target. Lieutenant Jerry Yellin, who would later fly the final combat mission of the war, described these high-altitude duels vividly. He recalled seeing Japanese fighters clawing upward, leaving dark exhaust trails as their pilots pushed throttles to their limits. But as they approached 25,000 feet, the Japanese aircraft began to wallow and lose energy. Their engines sputtered, likely running too rich because the superchargers could not supply enough air. In these moments, the Mustangs carved through their formations like blades of wind, their 6 machine guns blazing fiery lines across the sky. After firing, they climbed effortlessly, their Merlins singing with power. Japanese fighters could not follow. They fell away coughing and shaking as their engines struggled to stay alive. Dive performance sealed the verdict. The Mustang, with its laminar flow wing and strong structure, remained controllable at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour. Japanese fighters, by comparison, often experienced control reversal or catastrophic structural failure above roughly 400 miles per hour. Their wings fluttered, their control surfaces blanked out. Some aircraft simply came apart. Underlying all of this was preparation. American pilots had drilled endlessly in formation, discipline, deflection, shooting all-weather navigation and combat tactics, refined through years of real war. They flew against expert instructors and on some occasions evaluated captured enemy fighters to learn their weaknesses. Japanese pilots entering combat in 1945 had none of these advantages. Many had never fired their guns at anything more threatening than a stationary target. Some had never worn oxygen masks at altitude. Nearly all knew that their chances of survival were slim. Against this backdrop, even navigation became a dividing line between life and death. American pilots relied on detailed weather briefings delivered by meteorologists working with data from submarines, reconnaissance aircraft, and remote stations. They used updated maps produced from aerial photography. They carried reliable compasses and instruments. Rescue submarines waited along their routes, and PBY Catalina flying boats nicknamed Dumbos stood ready to pluck downed pilots from the ocean. The Japanese pilots had none of these supports. Their maps were outdated. Their compasses often malfunctioned. If they crashed into the sea, they expected to die. All these factors converged in the skies over Tokyo that morning, shaping a battle whose outcome had already been written long before the first tracer streaked across the sky. The clash between P-51 Mustangs and Ki-84 Hayates was not simply a fight between aircraft. It was the collision of two industrial philosophies, two national trajectories, and two vastly different capacities to wage modern war. Japanese pilots, already battling inferior machines and insufficient training, faced yet another invisible but powerful enemy, the unforgiving vastness of the Pacific and their own lack of navigational tools. Their maps were outdated, often years out of date, failing to show bombed airfields or shifted coastlines. Their magnetic compasses, badly calibrated and built with deteriorating materials, wandered unpredictably. Rafts that should have offered hours of survival leaked the moment they touched the water. Oxygen systems regularly failed at altitude, leaving pilots dizzy, disoriented, or unconscious before they even sighted the enemy. Most tragically, if a Japanese fighter went down over the ocean, there was no realistic hope of rescue. Their own command structures offered no organized search and rescue system, and Japanese submarines that might have attempted recovery were instead committed to desperate offensive operations or were already sunk. For Japanese pilots, every mission crossing the coastline carried a silent understanding: if they fell into the sea, they would never come home. The American situation could not have been more different. By sheer luck of geography and the deliberate planning of navigators, a returning Mustang pilot who found himself disoriented or lost after combat had a lifeline. The magnetic variation between Iwo Jima and the Tokyo region was small, and the relative alignment of longitudes meant that pilots could simply hold a south-southeast heading and trust that the island's dark volcanic cone would eventually appear. Mount Suribachi, rising from the ocean like a black spear, became the salvation of countless aviators. Even those returning in damaged aircraft, low on fuel or shaken from combat, could rely on the simple geometry of the map to bring them home. What might have been chaos became routine survival, and more than one man would later admit that the alignment of meridians felt like divine intervention. Still, the safe return of each Mustang was far from guaranteed, because every very long-range mission consumed resources on a scale that only American industry could sustain. A single raid involving roughly 100 Mustangs required about 57,000 gallons of high-octane fuel. Those fighters consumed about 230,000 rounds of half-inch ammunition in a single day of combat operations, and this represented only the fighters. The bombers required far more. Behind these numbers stood a colossal logistical machine stretching from factories in Detroit to refineries in Texas to ammunition plants in Missouri, all coordinated with efficiency that seemed almost impossible given the global crisis. Every mission depended on this network performing flawlessly, and it did. Supplies flowed into Iwo Jima like blood through an artery. Liberty ships, built at a rate that astonished even the American workers producing them, arrived at the island in a continuous rhythm. C-54 transport aircraft landed daily on the volcanic runways, bringing crates of spare engines, new tires, fresh guns, sealed ammunition containers, food and mail. Ground crews tore open the supplies and immediately began repairing and rearming the Mustangs for the next mission. Nothing was allowed to interrupt the tempo of operations. The constant hum of aircraft engines, the rumble of cargo trucks, and the clatter of cranes unloading crates became the island's heartbeat. Meanwhile, Japanese logistics descended into a kind of organized desperation. Aviation fuel was so scarce that training flights were cancelled, leaving new pilots to head into combat without so much as a practice dogfight. Ammunition was rationed even for combat missions, forcing pilots to hold their fire until the enemy was nearly on top of them. The Japanese Army Air Service and the Japanese Navy Air Service, which had never coordinated well even in peacetime, now fought bitterly over their dwindling resources like starving wolves circling the same carcass. Their quarrels consumed time and energy they could not afford to lose. The shortage of spare parts reached absurd extremes. Entire squadrons sat grounded for lack of something as trivial as spark plugs, hydraulic seals, or functioning radios. Mechanics stripped aircraft down to aluminum skeletons, cannibalizing parts to keep a few airworthy fighters on the line. In primitive workshops with hand tools, they attempted to fabricate replacements, but these improvised components performed poorly and often caused more damage when installed. A fighter might return from a mission only to be grounded indefinitely because a single part had failed and no replacement existed anywhere on the island. Against this background of scarcity, American pilots climbed into cockpits that embodied the advantages of industrial might. Their G-suits prevented the blood from draining from their heads during high-G maneuvers, allowing them to pull turns that would have left Japanese pilots blacked out. Their oxygen equipment performed consistently, feeding them clean air even at the highest altitudes. Their VHF radios transmitted clearly across long distances, allowing them to coordinate attacks, share sightings, and call for help. Their parachutes were regularly inspected and properly packed. Their life rafts worked. Their survival kits contained everything from water purification tablets to morphine. These details may seem small, but in aerial combat it is the accumulation of small advantages that decides life and death. Japanese pilots lacking these tools entered combat with multiple handicaps stacked atop the challenges of training and aircraft quality. Many flew with radios that crackled uselessly or did not work at all. Their oxygen systems frequently malfunctioned. Without G-suits, they suffered tunnel vision, bursts of eye hemorrhaging, and sudden blackouts during hard turns. Their parachutes were sometimes old, sometimes packed incorrectly, and sometimes entirely absent. They fought at a disadvantage before they ever fired a shot. Yet even the Americans discovered that technology had its limits. On the first day of June 1945, the Mustangs experienced what would later be called Black Friday. Roughly 150 Mustangs were en route to attack Osaka when they encountered a massive weather system that had not appeared in forecasts. A frontal wall stretched from the ocean surface to nearly 40,000 feet, filled with violent turbulence, relentless rain sheets of ice, and visibility so poor that pilots could not see their own wingtips. Instruments tumbled wildly. Compasses spun. Pilots found themselves flying blind, some losing orientation, others accidentally turning into one another. In a span of minutes 27, Mustangs were lost, 24 of them, to the weather alone. Even the best-trained pilots in the world could not always overcome the fury of nature. That day revealed the razor-thin line between mastery and vulnerability. It reminded American commanders that very long-range operations pushed human bodies, mechanical systems, and navigation methods to their absolute limits. Even so, Japanese pilots observing the aftermath saw only one thing: the Mustangs continued to return, continued to fly, continued to appear above Tokyo with relentless regularity. Their own air forces could not have survived such losses. For the Americans, Black Friday was a tragedy. For Japan, it was a reminder that even disaster could not stop the Allied advance. This reality shattered whatever morale remained among the defenders. Ki-84 ace Yoshio Yoshida wrote in his diary that seeing Mustangs strafing near the Imperial Palace ended his last illusions. He admitted that Japanese leaders continued to speak of victory, but the sight of foreign fighters over the Sacred Heart of the Empire told a different story. It revealed a truth that no speech from Tokyo could hide: Japan had lost control of its own sky. And to an island nation that had built its identity on martial spirit and divine protection, this was a symbolic defeat as devastating as any physical destruction. Major James B. Tapp, reflecting after the mission, explained that although dogfights generated adrenaline, the true test lay in the endless hours of navigating the Pacific. Fighters had been built for short bursts of violence, not 8-hour endurance trials over empty water. During these missions, pilots endured cramped seats that pressed into their backs, control sticks that had to be held steady for hours, and freezing relief tubes that often failed at altitude. Their legs cramped until they felt filled with needles. Their arms went numb. Their feet tingled. The mental strain was relentless. They knew that any mechanical failure would send them spiraling into the ocean where sharks' exposure or drowning waited. Inside this oppressive environment, every advantage mattered. The P-51D was built with ergonomics in mind. Its bubble canopy offered 360 degrees of visibility, allowing pilots to see behind them with a simple turn of the head. Adjustable seats and rudder pedals accommodated pilots of various sizes. The instruments were arranged logically with the airspeed indicator, altimeter, compass, and engine gauges placed directly in the pilot's line of sight. Everything was designed to minimize fatigue and maximize effectiveness. Japanese pilots sat in cockpits that reflected their nation's industrial strain. Rearward visibility was blocked by thick structural supports and a fuel tank placed behind the pilot's head. Controls were positioned awkwardly, requiring pilots to take their hands off the stick or throttle at critical moments. Instruments vibrated so badly at high-power settings that they blurred into uselessness. In the heat of combat, these deficiencies became fatal. When guns opened fire, the differences grew even more dramatic. The 6 half-inch machine guns on the Mustang were mechanically simple, extraordinarily reliable, and fed by belts long enough to permit multiple engagements. American pilots could fire ranging shots or expend ammunition pursuing a difficult target because they knew they had hundreds of rounds to spare. The Ki-84's armament powerful, though it was offered far fewer rounds. Its mixed battery of cannon and machine guns complicated ballistics, causing shells to follow different arcs. Pilots had to bring their targets dangerously close to ensure a hit, and even then ammunition ran out in seconds. Gunnery training magnified this divide. American pilots had fired thousands of practice rounds before entering combat. They learned deflection shooting, leading targets, and firing in short, controlled bursts. Many Japanese pilots had barely touched their triggers before their first real mission. Ammunition shortages prevented meaningful practice. This meant that even if a Japanese pilot survived long enough to get behind an American fighter, he might not know how to place his shots effectively. Against such an accumulation of obstacles, the Japanese air arm, though filled with courage and determination, found itself overwhelmed by forces beyond its control. The skies over Tokyo became a stage where industrial power, scientific refinement, and logistical mastery converged. The Mustang pilots did not win solely through bravery or skill, but through the combined strength of a nation, capable of building, fueling, training, transporting, and sustaining an air force unlike any the world had ever seen. The consequences of these disparities were felt immediately in the Pacific Campaign. The Mustangs based at Iwo Jima became more than escorts. They became predators, sweeping aside what remained of Japan's shattered air defenses. Across the spring and summer of 1945, these P-51 fighters achieved at least 206 confirmed aerial victories, accounting for roughly 3/4 of all Mustang kills in the Pacific theater. They intercepted Japanese fighters before they could close with the Boeing B-29 formations, silenced anti-aircraft positions during low-level sweeps and strafed airfields to destroy aircraft still being readied for takeoff. Their presence turned daylight bombing from a costly gamble into a crushing strategic hammer. With the skies cleared, the superfortresses could strike with increasing accuracy, further dismantling an industrial base already weakened by shortages, broken supply chains, and a workforce pushed past its limits. The Mustang became the spear point, and the B-29 became the hammer that followed through. Yet the most telling evidence of Japan's collapse did not come from combat reports, but from the reconnaissance photographs taken by modified P-51s. As the Mustangs flew over airfields across the home islands, they recorded scenes that even the most pessimistic analysts had not anticipated. Runways once crowded with fighters now held only derelict carcasses, airframes stripped bare for parts, their engines removed, their wings taken, their canopies missing. Some sat with no wheels. Others had their fuel tanks cut out. Many had been cannibalized to keep a single fighter vaguely airworthy. Wooden decoys painted in crude attempts to resemble real aircraft had been dragged around the tarmac to mislead American photo interpreters. Their proportions were wrong, their shadows betrayed them, their immobility revealed their true nature. These pathetic deceptions told a story more clearly than any pilot's testimony. Japanese aviation was nearly dead. Behind this visual collapse lay the mathematics that had determined the fate of the air war long before the first Mustang ever crossed the coast of Honshu. The United States built approximately 15,586 P-51 Mustangs and thousands of other fighters, bombers, and transports with standardized parts, identical performance, and predictable behavior. Production lines were synchronized, tooling was precise, replacement parts fit wherever they were needed. Training programs graduated tens of thousands of pilots with hundreds of flight hours. Japan, by contrast, produced a few thousand Ki-84s of inconsistent quality. Some could reach speeds near the published maximum. Others, often from the same factory, were slower by as much as 50 miles per hour due to sloppy, riveting, poor heat treatment or weakened engines. Pilot training had shrunk to a fraction of what was once required. These facts formed an iron equation. The United States could replace everything: aircraft engines, tools, fuel pilots. Japan could replace almost nothing. Fuel the blood of modern air power revealed the final inevitability. American tanker fleets delivered millions of gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline to Pacific bases every month. Refinery output in Texas, California, and the Midwest formed a river of fuel that flowed across the ocean through tankers and depots to the forward islands. Japan, by contrast, was reduced to manufacturing fuel from pine roots, coal byproducts, or anything that resembled hydrocarbons. Yields were pitiful. Quality was inconsistent. Late in the war, even training aircraft had their remaining fuel drained so that their engines could be assigned to one final kamikaze sortie. The very resource needed to build skill was diverted into acts of desperation. The P-51D, meanwhile, represented the distilled essence of the American wartime philosophy: standardize, mass-produce, refine, repeat. Every Mustang rolling off the line in California or Texas was essentially identical. Pilots transitioning from one aircraft to another found the controls in the same place, the performance curves the same, the quirks predictable. This consistency built confidence. It allowed pilots to plan precisely how their machines would behave in combat or during long overwater legs. The Ki-84, shaped under the pressures of scarcity, varied so widely that pilots joked they needed to test each aircraft like a new horse before learning how far they could push it. Some pulled hard without complaint. Others shuddered at high speed. This uncertainty created hesitation in battle, and hesitation killed. Operational readiness measured the final outcome of industrial strength. At Iwo Jima, Mustang units maintained availability rates above 80% despite volcanic dust, salt air, and long mission durations. Ground crews could replace a Merlin engine in roughly 4 hours using mobile cranes and standardized tools. Damaged wings, tail surfaces, and radiators were swapped out using prefabricated components flown in from American depots. Fighters hit on one mission could be in the air again by the next morning. Ki-84 squadrons, by contrast, often hovered below 40% serviceability. Mechanics lacked the tools, spare parts, and qualified technicians needed to keep aircraft flying. Some units had engines that required hand-fitting because manufacturing tolerances varied so widely. Others grounded entire flights because a single essential part had failed, and no replacement existed within hundreds of miles. Even the weather favored the Americans not by luck but by preparation. Dedicated Boeing B-29 weather reconnaissance flights swept ahead of each mission, gathering data on frontal movements, wind speeds, cloud ceilings, and hidden storm formations. High-frequency radio beacons placed on island bases and submarines transmitted navigational signals to guide fighters home. Rescue submarines stationed along the route were ready to retrieve downed pilots. Communications nets carried real-time updates across vast stretches of the Pacific. American pilots knew that if they were forced down, someone would search for them. Japanese pilots had none of these assurances. Their meteorological reports were sparse, their weather aircraft were few, their radios often malfunctioned, and when a storm rose from the sea, Japanese pilots flew blind into annihilation. In these final months, the contrast between the two air forces reached almost surreal proportions. The Japanese system resembled a structure collapsing inward, cracking at every level: fuel, aircraft, pilots, spare parts, logistics, communications. The American system resembled a machine accelerating toward its peak, each of its components polished, synchronized, and supported by an economy that dwarfed anything Japan could muster. The war in the air had become more than a contest of skill. It was the visible consequence of two nations' industrial destinies colliding at 20,000 feet. Every sortie from Iwo Jima reinforced this truth. When Mustang pilots streaked across Japan's industrial heartland, they saw factories whose roofs had been blown away, train lines twisted like ribbon, warehouses flattened, and smoke rising from fires that never seemed to die. They strafed aircraft that never took off, engaged fighters that never had enough altitude or power to fight effectively, and returned to a base where mechanics waited with tools already in hand. Meanwhile, Japanese pilots climbed into aircraft that might or might not function and took off with fuel that might or might not ruin their engines. Some climbed with determination, others climbed with resignation. All climbed knowing the odds had become impossibly long. Reinforcements could no longer save Japan. Replacement fighters were destroyed in shipping, burned on factory floors, or lost in training accidents caused by worn-out airframes and inexperienced instructors. Replacement pilots emerged from accelerated programs with barely the skills to take off and land, much less fight at high altitude against veterans flying aircraft of perfect mechanical consistency. Replacement fuel did not exist. Replacement engines could not be manufactured with the required precision. Replacement optimism had evaporated. What flew over Japan in the spring and summer of 1945 was not merely American aviation. It was American industry refineries and steelworks and assembly lines and machine shops and training academies rising into the air on laminar flow wings. It was the knowledge that every destroyed Mustang could be replaced, every damaged engine swapped, every fallen pilot honored and succeeded by another with hundreds of flight hours. And it was the realization that Japan, despite its warriors' courage, had no such reserves. The skies told the truth first. The war followed. By the time the summer of 1945 arrived, the truth of the air war over Japan had become undeniable even to those who once believed in the invincibility of the home islands. American pilots no longer wondered whether they would encounter Japanese fighters on their missions. They wondered whether any would dare to rise at all. Ace pilot Harry Krim summarized the new reality in words that cut through any remaining illusions. We owned the sky. It was not bravado. It was a simple statement of fact. The very long-range Mustangs had erased the protective moat of distance that Japanese strategists once assumed would safeguard the home islands. With that barrier removed, defeat was no longer a distant possibility. It was a mathematical certainty. Even so, total air supremacy did not come without sacrifice. The Mustangs performed missions that pushed aircraft and human beings far beyond the limits envisioned when the first prototypes rolled out of the factory. Roughly 85 American fighter pilots gave their lives on these very long-range missions, most not to enemy guns, but to weather, mechanical failure, disorientation, exhaustion, or simple misfortune. Every loss represented a man who had flown hundreds of hours, learned the craft of aerial combat, and braved the deadly monotony of the Pacific skies. Japanese losses, however, made this toll seem small by comparison. Entire units such as the 47th Sentai were reduced from strong, fully manned formations to only a handful of exhausted survivors. The 244th Sentai, once one of Japan's proudest fighter groups, was annihilated, reformed, and annihilated again. Their pilots fought with courage, but courage alone could not overcome the wreckage of a shattered aviation system. As the war neared its end, the final missions brought these contrasting realities into sharp relief. On August 14th, Lieutenant Jerry Yellin and his 19-year-old wingman, Second Lieutenant Philip Schlamberg, lifted off in what they believed to be yet another strike against enemy positions near Nagoya. They did not know that Japan had already agreed to surrender. The recall code that would have halted the mission never reached them. As they dove toward their targets, anti-aircraft guns fired fiercely, but no Japanese fighters rose to challenge them. The once formidable aerial defense of the Empire had evaporated. When Yellin pulled his Mustang up through a cloud bank to return to base, he found that his wingman was no longer behind him. Philip Schlamberg had been struck by a ground battery and became the final American combat death of the Second World War. Even in defeat, Japanese anti-aircraft gunners had fought with desperate resolve, but the skies themselves had become empty of fighters. The reason for this emptiness lay not simply in battlefield losses, but in the transformation of strategy brought about by the P-51D Mustang. With its speed range and firepower, the Mustang rendered the Japanese home islands defenseless from the air. Each time the fighters swept across the landscape, they destroyed the ability of Japan to maintain even a token fighter presence. And because the Ki-84 Hayate could never match the Mustang's combination of reliability and endurance, the outcome became inevitable. When the Boeing B-29s flew toward Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they did so without escort, not because escorts were unavailable, but because none were needed. The Japanese air forces had been broken long before the atomic bombs fell. The aftermath of the war offered a stark physical symbol of this disparity. Out of all the Ki-84 fighters ever built, more than 3,000 in total, only a single example survived intact. It rests today in the Chiran Peace Museum in Kagoshima, a lonely relic of a desperate attempt to match American technological power. Its faded paint, patched skin, and worn components tell a story of brave pilots betrayed by a nation that could no longer sustain them. In contrast, hundreds of P-51 Mustangs still exist. Many have been restored to flying condition, their Merlin engines still roaring with the same musical whine that once echoed above Tokyo. They appear at air shows around the world, polished and proud symbols not only of wartime heritage but of the industrial culture that built them. Their survival is a testament to materials, workmanship, and the vast resources that supported them. For the Japanese pilots who had faced them, the shock of seeing Mustangs over Tokyo was not simply tactical, it was existential. These aviators had been taught that the ocean would shield them, that distance was a weapon, that the enemy could not cross such vast stretches of water with fighters. Yet the Americans turned 1,500-mile missions into routine operations. The sight of P-51D fighters gliding above Mount Fuji, their wings gleaming in the sun, delivered a message more powerful than any radio broadcast. It announced the arrival of a new equation in warfare technology: multiplied by mass production equals victory. The Ki-84, for all its aerodynamic potential, was never given a fair chance. It entered service too late, in too few numbers, and in conditions too dire to allow its designers' intentions to shine. The Mustang, by contrast, benefited from the full weight of American manufacturing, engineering, and supply networks. Its components were machined to tight tolerances. Its engines arrived ready to perform. Its pilots trained in aircraft that behaved identically to the ones they would fly in combat. Every piece of the system built confidence, and confidence shaped victory in the air. The final lesson of the air war over Japan was thus not merely about hardware, it was about the transformation of warfare itself. For centuries, military success had often relied upon the valor of warriors, the brilliance of commanders, or the moral fervor of nations. But the Second World War proved that courage, however noble, could not defeat industrial modernity. When production lines replaced swords, when factories replaced shrines, and when logistical networks replaced ritual oaths, the balance of power shifted forever. The age of the samurai spirit gave way to the age of the assembly line. The P-51D Mustang became the emblem of this transition. It was not just a fighter aircraft. It was the physical embodiment of a nation's industrial strength, its scientific capability, and its ability to mobilize millions of people for a common purpose. The supercharger that let the Mustang climb above 30,000 feet was crafted in factories filled with skilled machinists. The wings that sliced through the air with laminar precision were designed by engineers who had studied airflow in wind tunnels powered by electricity from the Hoover Dam. The fuel that fed its Merlin engine flowed from refineries connected to pipelines that stretched across continents. To build a Mustang was to assemble the labor, intellect, and raw material of an entire civilization. The Ki-84 represented something different, a machine of skill and bravery, created by a nation that no longer had the time, resources, or stability to support it. Its pilots fought with determination, but determination could not overcome the physics of metallurgy, the statistics of fuel capacity, or the realities of manufacturing tolerance. Their struggle was heroic but hopeless, like swordsmen facing artillery. In the final weeks of the war, as the Mustangs swept over Japan with almost casual dominance, the message became unmistakable. Distance offered no protection. Geography offered no sanctuary. Courage offered no shield. The skies belonged to the side that could build more fuel, more train more, and maintain more. When American pilots returned to their bases after the last missions, they carried with them the knowledge that they had witnessed the end of one era and the birth of another. The war had not been won only in dogfights, though many had been fought brilliantly. It had been won in foundries, in laboratories, in engine plants, in shipyards, in supply depots, and in classrooms, where young pilots learned the mathematics of flight. The P-51D Mustang over Tokyo became the final chapter in a story that stretched from assembly lines in Detroit to the volcanic sands of Iwo Jima. It demonstrated the new truth of warfare that industrial supremacy shapes the battlefield long before the first shot is fired. The Japanese pilots who saw those silver fighters above the imperial capital understood this truth instantly. The world had become too large, and the machines too powerful for spirit alone to prevail. The samurai age had ended. The age of modern industry had begun.